Is that all okay?
Yes, brilliant. I can see it.
Brilliant. Okay. Right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Bill, for that lovely introduction. And thanks to everyone else for being here today. Um, so yes, as Bill had mentioned, this presentation will be indeed covering part of an article that I published in 2023 with JASO, which was titled Digital Ethnography in COVID-19, Improvisation and Intimacy. But the title of this talk is going to be Improvisation and Partisanship in a Global Pandemic, Insights from Educational Ethnography. I will be covering and expanding on that paper in this talk, but I will also be, towards the end, also elaborating on some newer elements that I am considering for a forthcoming paper that I'm currently working on as well, that's more tied to educational spaces. So that's how I'm going to be splitting the talk today. The majority will be on that paper, though. And so with that, we will get started. So to begin with, I want to talk about what I mean by improvisation, which was a key term I used in that paper. Literally, in terms of its definition, I kind of use quite a literal dictionary-based definition. So this idea of the action of responding to circumstances. So very simple definition itself. But where I picked up on this concept actually came through the work of other anthropologists who suggest that improvisation was consisted of three coexisting practices, and they listed improvisation alongside theory and everyday ethics. And I read this paper when I just finished my year of fieldwork during my doctoral degree at Oxford, and it resonated very powerfully with what I had just gone through with my own adventures. And I thought that once I had read it, I had realized that, I mean, not, of course, as Malky had suggested, um, improvisation has always been a very important part, if not essential part of the practice of ethnography. But I thought that my experience, as I want to take people down on the journey now, really also demonstrated not only that it is, in my opinion, also very essential and intrinsic, it is also it also has a pragmatic and practical limit. And so I want to sort of explore both those sides by taking you quite directly into my shoes and onto my journey of what I did in my PhD. So that's going to be essentially the majority of this talk. So with that, I'm going to start with how it all began when I arrived in Oxford. So I came in October 2019, very important to note the time of when I arrived. And I had arrived with a fairly clear mindset. I mean, I knew the degree I was taking. I knew the college I was in. The college will matter a little bit more later. But one thing that I had arrived with also was actually three different topics. So I had an initial topic, which was one that had evolved from my master's degree. And I felt tremendous purpose with that research. But at the same time, I also felt that that research was quite emotionally draining and demanding on my well-being. And so I was really thinking whether or not it would be wise to take a doctoral degree where I had to expend on that work for, 4+ years. And in the end, I thought probably it was best to take a break from it. So actually, what I applied with when I came to the university was not what I did. And what I applied with was concerned with social minorities in Japan, which was a project of an anthropology project I'd previously begun and continued at SOAS and UCL, respectively. So when I arrived, instead, I thought to myself, is there something I can do that is fresh, something that's a brand new start that will keep me energized for the years to come? But also avoid me necessarily having to deal with some of the themes that I've been dealing with for quite a while up until that point. So one of the topics I had in my head was one that was going to deal with transnational motorsports in Japan. And so I had contacts with some within the motor racing world because of a past where I was engaged with motor racing. And there were a lot of interesting personnel and resources around the university that I thought I might be able to draw on to make such a project occur. And there had been almost, if any, if any, there have been, to my knowledge, essentially no ethnographies that relate to motorsports that I found. And so it was, and let alone within a context like Japan, which I thought would have been a very interesting project to bring all together and very exciting. Now, I had two supervisors, both very wise, and one of them gave me some very advice I probably didn't want to hear at the time, but I thought was very wise and on reflection, which was that while this topic was quite exciting and interesting, when it comes to taking a doctoral degree, one thing you want to be careful, particularly if you're looking at ethnographic, if your ethnography is really the backbone of what will let you pass your degree, you want to make sure that your ethnography is one that is relatively, or to a reasonable extent, a fairly low risk in terms of a field site that would be stable, that would remain, that wouldn't just suddenly disappear. In my case for this project, it would have, I would have been directly hired into a team, for example. This would have meant that they could have gotten rid of me at any point. It would have been a transnational journey across various countries. And so it could have gone well, but it also may have been high risk. So we said, no, let's not do that. And so I actually went to what I was least likely I thought I'd do when I initially applied, which was starting a new project in international education in Japan. And as Bill mentioned, in particular, I was focused on this educational a set of educational programs that are run by the International Baccalaureate Organization, the IBO, and they run a bunch. I'm sure there are some people in this here who have heard of IB. And my project was concerned with the expansion of IB in Japan, as the Japanese government had made quite recently an arrangement with IB, the IBO, to expand it. And I'd always been interested in theories of internationalization and globalization, and I'd done lots of work on Japan before, so I thought this was a very ideal and interesting context and timely one to engage with. And one of the famous lines that my supervisor gave me when we sort of agreed on this was, well, think about it now like this, because the great thing about a school is that as a field site, it's ideal for a PhD because it cannot suddenly disappear. Or so we thought, right? And I had gone through so much in my first year after arriving in Oxford to try and begin my fieldwork in April 2020. The reason for April is that in Japan, like a number of other areas in East Asia, the academic year starts in April, not in September. And I thought it was very crucial if I'm going to get a realistic understanding of how a school is running, that I work from the beginning of an academic year. So I really rushed through to try and get what in Oxford, for our PhDs in Oxford, we call a PRS paper, which is a sort of first year paper we have to submit alongside ethics procedures and stuff before we would start our fieldwork in the case of anthropology. And I had really run through that quite quickly and tried to make fieldwork arrangements very quickly. And it was fieldwork itself was very difficult to organize originally. IB, like a lot of education that is related to the concept of international and global education, can often be quite a competitive space. And I reached out to something no less than around 50 schools in Japan to try and secure fieldwork arrangements. At the time, 5 responded and only 1 said yes. And this one school was incredible. They put painstaking effort to hire someone who is a non-Japanese national into Japan, into their school for the first time of their experience. And it is not an easy procedure by any means. So they put painstaking effort for me. We had a visa in hand, we had agreements made, and I was meant to arrive and start in April. But of course, by mid and late March, we had this arrive and this pandemic of what felt like unprecedented proportions. And at the time, so at this point, I really went from what felt like a very ordinary beginning to a doctorate to a completely extraordinary transition. When this is all before my fieldwork had started, right? It was just about to start, but it hadn't started. And so at the time I was here, I'm sure a number of you recognize this. This is the old entrance to St. Anthony's College. Behind the big tree on the left is where the dormitory that I was staying in is currently still today. And I spent a lot of my time here, which is on the inside of it. And St. Anthony's College is a very interesting place to be at this time because it is, I think it is the most international college in terms of its student population of any college in Oxford. It's around 85% are non-UK nationals. And that's significant because when COVID arrived, many people fearing lockdown departed on all forms of, they went flights home very quickly, often leaving personal belongings behind. We were left with dormitory rooms full of people's stuff and a very ghostly, eerily silent college campus. And ironically, it meant for those who remained, like myself, we actually had a very lucky space to be in order to, well, think and reflect on what was occurring around us. And you could see the very reflective statue is actually here in this little courtyard area. There's a bench right to the left of this picture where I used to sit down on, and I was initially doing a lot of pondering about what on earth is going on now and how to contextualize this with what I was doing. For a time, my degree just didn't matter anymore. Nothing, my career, none of this mattered. It felt, especially in the initial stages when we had little to no information and disinformation, that's it really put a lot of life and a lot of perspective in life for me at the time. Now, the irony for me about this is, despite the fact that I'm a British national and my hometown's London, I couldn't just go home because with the information we had at the time, I live in a house where I have my grandparents, and they were particularly vulnerable. So I did not dare go on a train back home or do anything that could have risked the situation from getting worse. So despite the fact I wasn't that far away from my hometown, it felt like now, at this phase, I was suddenly living in a different country almost. And and even within Oxford, it felt for a time like we shouldn't be venturing beyond a certain area. It was eerily quiet. In a way, it was very pretty and beautiful. Nature was running wild. It looked, you could see here, for example, but it was also just a very odd time. Um, and but to bring my supervisor back into this, now I have to be very careful. What I'm about to bring up on screen is not verbatim. This is not what they said, but I'm going to put this up as the internalization of what I felt they had delivered to me via email during this reflection phase. Okay. So don't think just because we're facing an unprecedented pandemic, you cannot complete your PRS paper on time. They were incredibly supportive of trying to get me through this phase and in a way trying to use the work as a distraction, because inevitably what had happened is because I could no longer do field work at a school, because schools shut down in Japan completely for multiple months. And even when they opened, as you might imagine, there were all sorts of restrictions in place to make sure you couldn't just get visitors from abroad suddenly coming to your institution. And so I had to sort of rewrite my paper and reconsider my ethics. And I was locked up in my room. I've got some pictures here of me locked up, just gazing outside the window and around this very eerie environment where no one is around. Normally, there's people walking around here quite often, and now it's just completely ghost town. And I rewrote and reconsidered what I could do. Now, with my focus on IB, I discovered upon further research that there is another way I could look at IB in a way I hadn't realized was possible, which was at universities, because I found out that you actually, the IB had created an IB teacher training program, this sort of initiative, which they implement into universities, and you can gain a certificate from it as a student undertaking it. And in Japan, they have now 8 universities that run this program. And I thought, well, perhaps, maybe, just maybe, universities might stand a slightly better chance than schools of adapting to the chaos of this pandemic. And that surely, in any case, by September 2020, this pandemic would have abated, because what's the chances that anything like that could continue longer than that, right? So there I was, rewriting my PRS in ethics, and I changed my fieldwork from schools. I was meant to work at this school, and then I moved to universities. I didn't work at this university, but it's an example of one that runs the same initiative. Um, but then, and the idea was that I was going to arrive in September 2020 to start. And again, we went through a visa process. We went through an ethics process externally with that institution as well. And that all was passed. And then in September, of course, the pandemic did anything but abate. And in fact, there was a massive spike at the time in the UK in particular, and that had made local news in Japan with British flags all over the Japanese news. It was just not a good time, a good image to be going, um, especially for institutions that were worried about, that have to worry about their customers and stakeholders, to use managerial terms that they would have been using. And so, um, because of this again, I had to do, I had to adapt again, right? I had to improvise even more than I had done before. And that improvisation and the nature of how I undertook that improvisation is the reason I'm talking here today, right? And here is that I moved to a complete digital ethnography. And I was able to do that very luckily because um, the university I was mainly going to do my fieldwork in Japan made what was very much an unprecedented decision in not only that institution's history, but almost all universities in Japan to run an entire program online, um, especially pre-COVID, right? And um, and I'll expand a little bit more on that context of Japanese HE later in this talk. But because of that, I was able to do the work. And all of the community that were forming this IB teacher training program, from the students to the staff, were all going to be undertaking the whole initiative online. Staff meetings were all online before and after. Student socials were all happening online at the time too, because although all of the students, in my case at this university, were Japanese nationals and from Japan, they were also living in different parts of Japan, and there were all forms of regional lockdowns too, which meant they couldn't all be physically there either. So it became actually the online approach to researching this became the only valid approach to trying to get a thorough ethnographic grounding of what everyday life was like. And so, strangely, I was able to take advantage of a digital medium, which was not common in my cohorts of anthropologists who were at the School of Anthropology. Many of them had to pause research for multiple years because you're working potentially in contexts where you just simply can't use an online medium, or an online alternative just isn't sufficient. So in my case, it really had worked out that the field site had attuned to what I had required to get my data. But there was a catch. And the catch, of course, was that I had to conduct a nocturnal ethnography. I had to stay in the UK. I couldn't go physically to Japan. So I moved to a different dormitory outside the college. This is in Summertown. It's a university dormitory. And I remained here for my whole year of the field work, where I would start field work at around 12 a.m. And I'd finish field work at around, depending on the day and what classes I'm attending, maybe 10 a.m. when the sun rises. It was completely nocturnal, and it was consistent for a year. That wasn't the plan. The plan was that, of course, at some point COVID will end, and then I will just switch from this to physical ethnography, but that never transpired. And it wouldn't be, actually, ironically, until I finished my fieldwork in September 2021, when the institution I was doing my institution of ethnographic focus decided to finally switch back to in-person teaching, and they haven't looked back from that since. So it was also temporally very imperative that I did this research in the exact precise window I had conducted it in, to get it done in this nature. But that didn't mean that everything I did was on screen. Predominantly it was, but there were some aspects of what I would call bringing Japan to Oxford, where I had physical items that would be delivered to me, which were necessary material in order for me to help assist, participate, and facilitate parts of that program as part of my participant observation at the university. So I'd receive packages throughout the year. This picture is one such example where I would have lots of course materials that I was required to have in order to help with the program, and they just didn't have digital equivalents to these. So they had to we wanted to send them in the post. Thankfully, delivery services were working well enough to facilitate this. But I want to read a little note that came from this colleague of mine at the time, who's the one who sent these materials. So they wrote, "Dear Akira-san, I hope we will be able to see each other in Japan in spring. My family is also looking forward to seeing you too. Sincerely, on the 14th of October, 2020." And it is with my delight, with absolute delight, that I can say that I finally met this individual in person 2 months ago in Tokyo, some 4 years after we had this exchange. And it was a very emotional sort of meeting, even though we had known each other for some time now online. To have not seen each other in person for such a scale while developing such a connection was a very was a moment that made me realize that I'm still dealing with some of the emotional vestiges of what I went through in my field work today still. But I always found this quite an emotional moment when I look back at this. And so I did get sort of physical correspondence through the nature of letters throughout my at different junctures in my year. And of course, I didn't go in spring 2021, as they wrote here, that we were hoping for, because we had another spike and institutionally was just not viable. So my whole year became an online experience. So my everyday, or every night rather, sort of looked like this. I think this is actually one of the more niche nights where we were running a hybrid classroom. So this was some of the initial month, like probably the first month when I was engaging with fieldwork. So you can see here, we've got the hybrid classroom on the screen here. So I can see the physical classroom from my screen, but then we've also got some people tuning in online. Eventually, very quickly, this moved to more people going online slowly, and the physical classroom would empty. And in general, though there was fluctuation throughout the year, most of my everyday experience ended up looking more like this, where we're all looking at each other through different Zoom boxes or on Teams, and we are engaging in breakout sessions, and otherwise we're watching the main lecture in the main room, and I'm taking all my messy notes on the sides there, as you can see. And this really defined my every night for the entire year. I ended up going to different universities for comparative observations, and also I engaged with work with the IB themselves because they had gone all online. And I'll touch into some of the significance of all of that a bit more later, but this is just to give you a bit of a flavor. Now, in my paper that was published in 2023 with Jasso, I covered a decent amount of this, I think, in my paper. But one aspect that I didn't really touch too much on, that I'm thinking I might be something I want to expand on a little bit more in the future, relates to something that other anthropologists call the semi-bounded space. So people familiar with digital anthropology, I'm sure, knows this very well. And that Malaby sort of considered that digital domains were semi-bounded. And this idea is that, it's what's going on the screen, in my context, is just as important to be describing and talking about of what's going on off the screen. And in my paper, I predominantly focused on the dimensions of, once I got into fieldwork, what was going on my screen. Definitely a lot less on what was going on outside within the local context of Oxford and more broadly within the UK. And there was a lot going on reflection that I hadn't really talked about when I did that paper, that I really I thought was very important when we're talking about positional awareness, that I feel like I had missed, and I wanted to expand a little bit on that here for now. So, and on that point, I wanted to look particularly on affective health. As another example of this form of extreme improvisation that I went through, and an aspect that I think I did touch on in my paper, but I wanted to talk a little bit more on here. Now, before the pandemic, we've had conversations about the importance of keeping track of our emotional states as ethnographers in the field. I, for example, had had the fortune of reading this particular paper before I had started my fieldwork. And one thing I thought was very useful was this idea that you can create a second logbook or a second set of notes that keep track of your emotional states through the days that you're, or the nights that I am engaging with work in the field, and that whenever I then draw on something that I want to use with my data later, I would then go to my emotional state book and I would be like, right, how do I make sure that what I wrote there, how do I make sure I appropriately temper it with how I was feeling on the day? Um, and so I remember this was a very useful thing. I thought was going to be very useful when I started fieldwork before COVID, but it proved even more. It proved critical when I ended up doing research the way I ended up undertaking it in the end. Um, and not least because many ethnographers, and so, I think I tend to call myself, for those who were taking doctoral degrees at the time of COVID in anthropology and were mainly dedicated to ethnographic methods. I think we were the second unluckiest group, the ones who arrived in 2019, or in my case at least, because I was just about ready to start fieldwork, but crucially I didn't, right? I hadn't started when the pandemic broke out, so I was able to shift my methodological approach a little bit, right? I could rewrite, I could try higher education, I could, you know, find a way to make it work with the benefit of hindsight, with the benefit of knowledge of the pandemic. So with others, they couldn't do that because they would have engaged in those who arrived in 2018, for example. Many of them were already in the field, maybe have done half their year of field work. And suddenly this pandemic has come out of nowhere. So unsurprisingly, such ethnographers were describing feelings of despair at the time. And there were all forms of other emotional outbursts you can see from some of these some of this literature at the time, which is very, very specific literature for its time, right? But um, it's was something I really could relate to in a different way. I definitely was much more fortunate than, for example, these two authors, if you read their accounts. But um, I was also dealing with forms of perhaps not despair, but perhaps, well, similar interlinked emotions. I was very worried about my family in London, in the UK and across other areas and friends. I was worried about how, you know, will someone suddenly get infected? All of these things are occurring in the back of my head, right? So at this time, while I'm undertaking work in the field, and these are aspects that I think I neglected to. I didn't really talk too much about, I think, in my paper, and I want to talk much more about that going forward. We were also dealing with moral dilemmas of social distancing and proximity. And even within our local context in Oxford, there was, and for those of you who were here in Oxford, I'm sure there are a number here who were here at the time. Um, Oxford itself, even within the university and across different departments and colleges, were negotiating COVID in very different ways. Some were being a lot more protective. For example, as I will get into, I think a little bit later, some departments maybe perhaps wore masks more than others. There are some interesting intercultural dimensions to how we thought about how we would guard against COVID and protect each other against COVID, and how much social responsibility we should take for each other. That was something that I was also, again, trying to keep on calculating and recalculating and reconsidering if what I'm doing is appropriate, what I'm thinking of others is appropriate, all while in the isolation of lockdown itself. Which of course was its own challenge in a very strange time. In my case, also living at night, and having a community that was online. So I wasn't completely isolated thanks to my field work, but it was, of course, a very jarring form of sociality in the time and the period in which I was undertaking it. And so in the UK alone, right? And a lot of what I'm going to be listing on this particular page is literature that relates to work that was done in the UK. But this work can easily relate to a number of contexts around, including Japan in my case as well, of questions that were being asked at the time and tensions that were being generated by such questions. These two authors in particular talked about the rise of online shaming culture of social distancing. And I was someone who was a lot more quite strict against those who were not really protecting social distancing, or some sentiment of social distancing. But there was also another extreme, right? Where if we where there is like no tolerance at all, and so we're balancing between the in the UK context where we had quite significant levels of people who were perhaps not really adhering to any form of social distancing guidelines, um, and but also versus the reality of having some tolerance, right? For does everyone need to wear a mask? Some people have medical conditions that mean they cannot wear one, for example, versus cultural tensions, such as, but we, are socialized in certain cultural contexts to wear masks when we are young. And this is a responsible thing to do. So why do other people not do it? To give you a very fascinating window into this, I'm sure some others could relate, even within Oxford University itself, and you would find this in many others, we would have, for example, the Nissan Institutes of Japanese Studies or the China Center in St. Hugh's College, where people were wearing masks all the time, comparatively to some other areas where perhaps this was not the case within college communities and such. So it was a very, very, of course, we're quite an international community at Oxford as well, right? Within the student community as well in particular. And so we were all negotiating all sorts of different expectations at the time. And not least, and that was also true within my dormitory complex and area as well. And there were arguments and also occurring even during my fieldwork at night, happening outside over such issues. Um, and touching even further on this, an aspect that I absolutely did not talk about in my paper, but I think is something I want to maybe look on maybe more in the future, is the rises in institutional racism and sort of the exacerbation or exposure of other inequities that were brought about during this particular period in various forms. The one I want to just give an example of was ethnic scapegoating. These authors here were talking about those of East Asian sociogenetic backgrounds who would be scapegoated for being those who might pass a pandemic to someone else. They were talking on US campuses in this case, but I also had a number of friends who were in my complex where I was staying who were of such origins. And they also encountered forms of sometimes it was name calling on the streets, local streets in Oxford, North Oxford, right? Things that would have felt probably a bit unconceivable before this, and probably unconceivable a bit more now, but was something that completely reared its head at the time. Um, and it really exposed a lot of the biases that were normally quietly going about in some of the local population's heads. We also had issues with police violence going on as well, more broadly. In this again is just from the UK context alone. This was obviously not just by no means limited to the UK context, where those from certain ethnic backgrounds were being targeted more by local police forces than others because uh, of this bias that they felt that they're the ones who will not be protecting, who will not be the most protective of making sure that COVID didn't spread and the ones to be blamed the most for doing so. I had one individual in particular who lived next to me, who lived near my dormitory, who actually had very traumatic experience in particular. And it got to the point where I had to, because they didn't really have the ability to leave their room and actually access food for a time, that I would try and bring stuff to them. Um, and I also had people looking out for me in other areas of my rooms in the dormitory complex too. So it really brought out a lot of the worst and best of what we can be as humans. And it's an aspect that I completely ignored in my paper, but I think I really want to talk more about this because it's when we talk about positionality as an ethnographer, I completely ignored all of these experiences that I was also were also embodied with me while I was undertaking all of my work at the nights. This is all the stuff happening in the day that I didn't really talk about before. Eventually, my fieldwork ended and I returned to life with the sun, or I tried. Of course, when fieldwork ended, I thought, well, I had gotten so used, right, to working at night that unfortunately, when it got to the phase of writing up my thesis, I found that I couldn't think in the day and I had to write at night. So my timetable, my body clock got better after fieldwork, but it wasn't significantly better. And it probably wouldn't have been until I submitted my thesis in the summer of 2023, where I finally was able to start learning how to adjust back more consistently. And I would say probably it's not till not too recently when I think maybe now I'm finally back to complete normal. So yes, at least a good 3 years, 4 years, perhaps, which I found quite profound. I never thought it would take so long. But such was how my body was jarred with that year. So, needless to say, there were a lot of challenges for me and for many improvising digital ethnography during this time, this specific time. Projects that were, in many cases, not designed for digital ethnographic approaches, but were heavily improvised into them. Or in my case, where it was kind of, sort of designed more for digital ethnographic, for digital ethnography, but it was more of a gamble than anything else in my situation. It was still a heavy compromise. And so, unsurprisingly, we had those who were doing work, who did field work before and after the pandemic, um, commenting about lots of the limitations of improvising to such a medium, right? We had this idea that it can be rather limiting, sometimes inappropriate to sustain the type of intimate social relationships we would ideally want with our participants if we were to understand them. Um, and in this author's particular case, they had concerns over issues with, for example, censorship, where they felt that if it was an online interview, an online talk, they would not reveal a lot of what they would do in person. So these were very real compromises that really hurt the type of data they gathered. One interesting concept that this author put forward was this idea, therefore, that the relationships that they had managed to achieve, um, when they describe this idea of inappropriate or rather limiting, is that it was remote. It was they could achieve little more than remote connections, remote relationships, right? This is a very interesting concept because another author that was also doing fieldwork in the same sort of time period before and after also used this word in their own paper. And I do talk a lot more about this in my paper. I'm not going to be talking about this in much detail here, but they use this concept called remote embeddedness. And in their case, they used it to describe the ability to successfully gain a thorough level of social intimacy with your participants online. Um, and so I thought when I read this, it really exposed a lot of the challenges that theoretically we were wrangling with, when we talk about the legitimacy, the place of, and of digital knowledge vis-a-vis physical, or what I often will also call analog knowledge, right? And so I preferred this idea of calling it digital embeddedness, which is what I felt I had achieved in my field sites, because our relationships could not occur in any other way in my case. And so we all kind of made a lot of effort to try and make it work in a digital space. We had social pub events happening quite regularly. We had all forms of chats, all forms of COVID commiseration meetings, and all forms of um, of socials that did not really have any counterparts in the physical world, because they were just not simply possible. And these all contributed to achieving a very strong amount of digital embeddedness within my context, which is why I find that, when we talk about words like remote, um, you know, this gives you this idea of distance, which feels very different to closeness, right? And intimacy. And so and it's something that I definitely expand a lot more in the paper, where this can relate to um, older debates across, not within digital anthropology alone, let alone beyond, where we were talking about how these words are not very useful if we want to get a more realist, if we were to treat digital knowledge as ontologically equal, as ontologically just as valuable and legitimate as physical knowledge. Um, so we had conceptual challenges, grounded challenges, conceptual challenges, and we also had other practical, pragmatic challenges. This is one example of mine, where I actually lost funding because I did this year online. So I had applied to all forms of funding for my fieldwork. I had secured funding. I was meant to be awarded it halfway during my fieldwork, only to be told halfway in my fieldwork online that because I had done the work online and that I had written the application for one that would have been done physically, that um, they could not award me the money. And the biggest irony of all of this was by staying in Oxford, it was actually more expensive because we were paying for university dormitories. And whereas if I was in Japan, the university was going to cover all of my, living expenditures and food expenditures and so on. So it was actually far more of a financial burden to have stayed. And then I lost funding, which was and I'm sure I was anything but alone in the law in issues regarding research funding at the time. Again, another aspect that really was another aspect that I had to rattle and wrestle with while also undertaking the degree. Um, but despite all that, all of these legitimate challenges, um, it is when I this quote I think can be perhaps taken as potentially maybe a little bit can be considered a little bit essentialist potentially, but I thought it was a quote that really resonated with my journey, which is which was a quote that was made before COVID-19, just before, which said that if any anthropological fieldwork, and I think here we can reinsert anthropological with ethnographic fieldwork, went strictly to plan, it would actually have to be considered a failure. And that might be a little bit extreme, potentially. But I thought that the reason it resonated was it made me realize that in my case, the type of data I collected would just simply not have been, the type of thesis I ended up forming would simply have not have been possible without undergoing all of these trials and tribulations and ups and downs and uh, and limit to access, but then also permission for new forms of access. I think just to give one example, I was intending to do absolutely no field work with the IB organization itself, the IBO. And normally, because it's impossible, they have administrative offices in a number of different countries, but none of them would have been Japan. And it wouldn't have been realistic to do it should I have been in Japan. But because they had went all online, which was unprecedented for them, I was able to do participant observation within the IBO as well and compare what's going on centrally in their organization to what's happening in the local context, more local context of the university, as something that just would not have been a valid perspective if I had done this work physically, which would not have been possible to do. So therefore, in my paper that I had, I sort of had my sort of main emphases. One was that the extremities of the pandemic reminded us that improvisation is intrinsic to ethnography, but it also exposes the practical and pragmatic limitations, right? Which under certain circumstances we have to give way to. And also as an expansion to that, our effective the extremities of what our effective health can deal with, right? And I think sometimes I felt that I was a little bit guilty of myself for pushing through with work, knowing that I was not necessarily always in the best emotional state to do so. And I think that's something that I wanted to reflect on a lot more, um, is to see what lessons can be learned as ethnographers about this, and how we be better, more morally, better moral obligations to ourselves, right? And making sure we're also taking care of our and realizing where we are out of our depth in the field as well. And it also, the other aspect was that it reminded us that the digital mediation should be considered no less ontologically legitimate as physical knowledge, despite the fact that it is also very important to still recognize the digital mediation in countless contexts in the world is much more resource dependent generally, but it is also therefore something that is very contingent based on context as to how relevant and appropriate that mode might be, but that for where it is, it should not be considered something that is less than what you might have done in the physical field. Which it personally felt like it was a bit strange that I had to emphasize this, but a lot of post-COVID literature coming right at the time was sort of suggesting this sometimes, and I felt that this was something that maybe we need to be reminded of. And so this thesis was the product of this and the arguments of this thesis, the core arguments, the core theoretical constructs, of course, the grounded knowledge and data that I collected was all the product of this journey that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. So here, Bill, I was thinking we could take a 5-minute break if that's okay. And I thought we could then go, I was then going to transition for a brief time to some new aspects that I'm playing with for a working paper.
Yes, thanks very much, Akira. I mean, normally what we do, we try to leave about 30 minutes for question, answer, and discussion.
Okay, let's do a
So we could,
3-minute break,
yeah, we could
and
take a
then we can
3-minute break,
definitely
you
do
know,
that. Okay,
people
let's
can
do
get a
that.
drink, bathroom break, et cetera, and reconvene. And then if there's anything else you want to mention to kind of set up the Q&A, that's fine. But otherwise, if you're happy to do so, I think we can transition straight into Q&A and open discussion.
Yeah, so from after I finish the next section, then yeah, we can go straight to Q&A.
Okay. All right. Very good.
Great.
So should we just break for a minute or two then?
We'll break for a minute or two. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Just for those of you who are still listening online, this might provide a nice opportunity to get your thoughts together. Feel free to raise your hand once the Q&A starts with any questions you may have, or if you prefer to put those in the chat, we'll kind of monitor the chat. So we'll be right back in a minute or two. So I think, Akita, if you had a few more points you wanted to outline whenever you're ready,
Sure.
feel free.
Yes. So yeah, welcome back, everyone. Yes, I'm just going to for finally, before I end, I wanted to give a smaller talk on some new aspects that I'm currently working with, particularly because I'm also very interested in in people's thoughts on this as I work through things. On a paper that's going to sort of, to an extent, compare and contrast some of the challenges that we are dealing with as ethnographers working in digital spaces with educators working in digital spaces. And educational settings have been, of course, no stranger to dealing with the idea of digitality. There's this buzzword called e-learning in education, which has been around for some time. 1 second. This term of e-learning actually has been around since before it emerged in the 1990s, from my knowledge. So it's been around for some time. But usually this idea of e-learning was quite generally quite looked down upon in all forms of national education systems for some time. It's become a lot more of a term that has gained a lot of traction and popularity, not least since COVID-19. Of course, COVID-19 spurred a lot more debate and talk within educational settings about the role of digital learning in classroom settings, both within schooling and within higher education. And of course, even more recently, we've now got the introduction of all forms of new technologies that very much relate to this and interlink, such as everything under the suite of AI, which often increasingly refers to all forms of different technologies. And there is often, there is consistently still quite a disconnect between the amount of digitalization that educational policymakers often want to make to change education systems versus what often teachers on the ground in local settings believe is pragmatic based on resources afforded to the institutions within different various national contexts. This is certainly a tension that is currently occurring within a Japanese context as well, but is also something that we can see also in the UK. So within my field, focusing on Japanese HE, um, one important one important aspect of the context to grasp before I talk about my examples is the idea that compared to a cultural context like the UK or the US and North American, Euro-American sphere, this idea of online learning was quite inconceivable in many spaces. You would have found very few examples where this was occurring in a consistent fashion in Japan prior to COVID-19 and even after COVID-19. And so because of that, it was quite unsurprising that you will find a lot of local literature in the country at the time when they were faced with the challenge of switching to online environments within educational spaces, that many authors thought that they were doing so quite poorly. And in many cases have returned back to a mode in which they refuse to go back to online modes of learning like they had to in the past. Now, some of this is to do with indigenous practices of pedagogy and within a Japanese context, for example, where a lot of education is meant to be practiced socially with all forms of performative aspects as well, which can only really be practiced and embodied in person with people around you. It's there's a lot more to expand on that. But needless to say, the result has meant that in comparison to a number of other systems, HE systems you might find in the world and also schooling contexts, there's been a relative hesitancy and resistance to adapt to implement, so far at least, more digital approaches to learning, although they are occurring in more localized areas in Japan as well. So with this context in mind, one thing that was quite fascinating in my work, which was dealing with specifically what was called the IB Educator Certificate. So that's the name of the initiative that was running, that I studied in my doctorate. I had a main university that I was working at, but I also had other universities where I was doing comparative research. And I had an incredible diversity of ways in which various faculty found digital learning to be appropriate and inappropriate, and tremendous scale of diversity on these sentiments. So in the one I was working in, as you might have gathered when you saw some of the images that I explained before, what we might just call University and Educator A, so this institution and these people, would found a lot of worth in mixing mediations. Of course, during the pandemic, they thought it was obviously quite essential that they did so. But post the pandemic, this institution runs predominantly offline now and does think that that's the stance it should be taking, that this type of initiative, when it comes to teaching, you just cannot undertake teacher education when you're being trained for a classroom environment without physical components to that teaching. So now we run predominantly offline again. However, this university did take a lot of what it was forced to learn during the pandemic and use components also to mix in online modes of learning within the course too, which is actually not necessarily that common within Japanese HE programs at the moment. So they did very much, one of the rare examples of a university that took initiative to try and really reflect on what was what they had to do at the time and what modalities would be appropriate in a post-pandemic environment. But then you had University B, an educator B at another university who even during COVID refused to do anything online. And they had only in-person meetings. So everyone's wearing masks and they're going to their classes and being extra careful. And post the pandemic as well, they have absolutely no intention on working with digital mediation whatsoever and believe it to be completely resource-wise irresponsible from a national educational perspective of trying to get the relevant technologies into classrooms, which there is a lot of arguments for based on a lack of resource going into the full education system there at the moment across the country. But also this idea that it is also perhaps in their eyes an overrated medium for students to be getting involved with, which of course I think would be a lot more controversial given the way in which our economies and technology is moving towards. And then you also had educator and university C. And I think in a Japanese context, this group was particularly radical because they, in the middle of the pandemic, decided that they were going to launch an online-only version of this, which continues to this day, even post the pandemic, in which the whole experience is online and how you then learn how to teach and the resources you receive on what it means to teach in an online capacity is fundamentally almost a completely different program to what you learn in person, because you start to learn how to use all forms of different software and learn how to use different approaches to teaching using digital mediums with software that could only be possible with that software and not with in-person modes to education. And then this university might collaborate with the odd school in a Japanese context, which actually might be which is certainly one of the rarer ones, where they might say, oh, maybe you can run an entire IB education fully online if you want to. And such schools, while rare, do exist even in Japan as well. And so there is this very interesting field of tension within this backdrop between often policymakers who often are in more privileged institutions such as national governments or transnational organizations who have been often pushing for the increase of digital education, but are often met with a lot of resistance on the ground with those who say that in many contexts, and I'll just take Japan as an example, who are already often completely overworked and often do not have time to be afforded to have the professional development necessary to undertake such a change in education. And even if they could, would not be confident that the resources would be adequately distributed across the system to really realize this, let alone the worries of socioeconomic disparity that might occur between different with different children and parents across the country. So there is a lot within this space that I'm now working with, and I'm hoping to sort of have a conversation about the politics of digital learning going forward. So any thoughts on this would be fantastic. So I'm going to just end with this idea, and something I might be looking as a comparative when I do this work is some of the common challenges between educators and ethnographers, you know. We're all, even within digital ethnography, one thing we are trying to also learn from the pandemic is that we perhaps need to be more literate on digital mediums. But at the same time, we also need to be aware of when it is responsible, when it's important. We need to be aware of when it is critical to apply this knowledge to our work and our field sites, and when it is inappropriate to do so. We have the same sort of debates happening with digital learning versus physical learning. And finally, also to realize the growing fluidity between these mediations. They're growing these modes that are combined together, and therefore need to be, and it's a point that we need to be growingly aware of. So whenever research we are engaged with, we're making sure we are covering both these aspects, because usually they are intertwined. And with that, I'm going to end. I do have some references that if anyone wants these, you can send me an email and I'll send them straight to you. You can also take a screenshot. This will also be recorded, so you can also look back at these. And otherwise, we'll be ready for the Q&A, Bill. So thank you for listening, everyone.
Thank you so much, Akira, for that really thought-provoking revisiting of your doctoral research experience.